And now we're going to go about a robbery that happened in Rochester, New York, that's going to be shortly made into a major motion picture. This is not going to be a straight-to-DVD type of movie about an armored car robbery that if you went to pitch the idea as fiction to a movie guy, he would say, "Nah, there's no way." What, you got an Irish priest involved, an Irish-American cop, you've got the IRA involved, supposedly. They said, no one would believe it. But this is the second book that's come out, and the difference between the two books, Sam Miller, who really organized the robbery of the armored car robbery up in Rochester, New York, that got $7 million. Sam was a former member of the Irish Republican Army. He was in Lancashire during the Dirty protest and the Blanket protest. When he got out, he snuck his way into the United States and got involved with this armored car robbery. And when the money came down to New York City, that's where New York City got involved, because the money ended up at a safe house down in Stuyvesant Town that Father Pat Maloney, the saint of the Lower East Side, was involved in. Father Pat's been a guest on WBAI many, many times here talking about it. I was the editor of the Irish People newspaper, and I remember putting the address of Father Pat where he was being held in what federal penitentiary, and we had him on WBAI during the trial, much to the chagrin of the lawyers who hated it, who never wanted Father Pat to come on. And Father Pat would say, "Give me the phone." We would call him up on Saturday on Radio Free Aaron, and he would rail about the judge and about the injustice of the American judicial system. But now there's another book out, and Corey, who's this now?
Right, this is Gary Craig's book. It's a meticulously reported book called 7 Million, and it has to do with a heist that took place in January of '93. You had masked gunmen walking into a Rochester Brinks depot with terrible security. I think they walked in the open door, and they tied up the guards, and they made off with $7.4 million. And it's the FBI calls it the top 5 armored car heists in history. Now, later that year, the FBI in New York City arrested a guy in Queens named Sam Miller. He was a former IRA rebel who spent, like John said, years in Lancashire prison. And then he came to the United States, and they found $2 million, the FBI did, in this Stuytown apartment that was rented, basically used by Father Pat Maloney as a safe house.
Yeah, and for battered women and things like that.
Right. Now, Father Pat, we've had him on before talking about this, and I've interviewed him.
And he's
several
listening
times.
right now. I talked to him this morning.
Right. So he's always denied, and he even served 5+ years in federal prison for this, but he's always denied involvement in this heist, that he knew about this or participated in it. But he was arrested too, and so eventually was an upstate police officer named Tom O'Connor. Now, Gary Craig, who we have on the line now, was and still a reporter for the local newspaper, the Democrat and Chronicle, and he covered this story, and he covered it for years, all up until the present day. And he's finally got a book out called 7 Million. So, Gary, welcome on this morning.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me on. Right.
So, listen, pick up the story. I mean, you picked it up. A lot of the major media, concentrated on the downstate end in New York, the arrests down here. But you always kind of were more plugged into the upstate arrests of O'Connor, and followed up the other leads with Ronnie Gibbons, who was later found years later found dead and presumably murdered, and probably in connection with this thing. So just pick up and talk about your book and
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I covered the arrest down in the city, not so much the trial. And then, as you mentioned, what happened was in '96, and I actually interviewed Father Pat in prison in probably '95 and did a story about some of the harassment he was getting there, because they still had on his record as if he were an active IRA member, which, the evidence wasn't there at the time, and did some coverage of that. And then when this guy, Ronnie Gibbons, he disappeared in '95. We found out about it in '96. He'd come to Rochester to get his cut of the money he believed he was due, and because he'd been in on some of the initial planning, but then got cut out of the actual robbery. And he was a mystery. The cops didn't know about him or anything until he was reported missing. And it became sort of this weird mission for me, because I really liked Ronnie's family a lot. A number of them live in Liverpool. Ronnie was a retired boxer in New York City. His sister still lives down there. And just really liked them, and for years and years kept trying to find a way to keep Ronnie in the news until he was found, or see if we could find. We all pretty much knew he was dead. And then in 2011, sure enough, it turned out that some body parts that had been found in the late 90s in Cape Vincent, which is up at basically the St. Lawrence intersection with the Great Lakes, were Ronnie's. I mean, there was a foot and a torso. His head was never found. I assume it's just in the water out there. And I'd had, through the years, and it wasn't an idea, I've got to write a book. There was a story that I'd followed so long, as you guys said, the cast of character was just, you really couldn't make it up, that it just said, this would actually make a pretty interesting book. And it wasn't that just I was driven that I had to write a book one day. It was more that the story was just so rich with characters and the narrative.
Yeah, Gary, I first read Sam Miller's book, and from Sam's point of view, Sam was the ex-IRA man who organized the robbery of the armored car up there. And it's from his point of view about how he organized it and who was involved and who was not involved. And, of course, he had to be very careful about who he was talking about because it's still an active case to the extent most of the money has never been recovered. But what I found with your book, and it was the interesting angle, it was from the FBI's point of view, a lot of it, because you had inside track to about how they covered the case and how they went undercover, and also about Tom O'Connor. I never realized, like from reading your book and knowing everything that we know now, he was more or less a serial killer. I mean,
there's two other. Well, I mean, if you count Ronnie, and again, we don't, as Corey was saying, we don't really know exactly what happened to Ronnie, but it's pretty good. I think we could all assume that he was murdered. The question is who of the suspects up here was responsible. And Tom was one person that we know he had come to see. Whether or not Tom was the one that did the deed or not, we don't know. But Tom O'Connor, the cop you're talking about, who was suspected to be the inside guy of the armored car heist, but was acquitted at trial, he was the suspect in two other homicides here in our region. One, a boyfriend of a woman that he'd previously dated, and another was just a weird connection with some familial dispute. And he was a suspect in both of those homicides.
Right. And like a lot of things with history, timing is everything. Now, when the investigation started, and it was huge with the FBI, and because of the alleged IRA links, the FBI treated it as a terrorist case. But then something happened in 1993 that the case was completely dropped. Maybe you could tell us what happened with the FBI there.
It's pretty. When you go back and look at the night of the robbery, there's an FBI agent. He still lives locally by the name of Bill Dillon. He's retired FBI. And he had been involved. So Tom O'Connor, the ex-cop, smuggled Sam Miller into the country in the mid-'80s. And Sam lived here in Rochester for a while, sort of under the protection of some friends and stuff. And there had been a hunt for Sam. There was basically the FBI figured out he was here in the mid-'80s, but they could never find him, and he moved to Queens, took the family and moved to Queens. And so the very night of the robbery in 93, Bill Dillon says, if you think Tom O'Connor is the inside guy, you should find this guy Sam Miller. And within a couple of weeks, they probably a month or so, they found Sam, in Queens, Jackson Heights, and start surveillance. Well, within weeks of that, the first World Trade Center bombing happened, and of course, everything gets scrapped as far as police investigations, unless for some reason they're so imperative at the time, and it just gets put on the shelf. And it's not until really months later, late July, when it's resumed, and that's when they see the money being moved into the apartment that you earlier mentioned.
Yeah, and what came out in your book and in Sam's book, Sam always had the fantasy and he loved comic books.
Yes.
And it seems like the robbery, it was almost like a scene out of Goodfellas where De Niro was telling him, whatever you do, don't spend the money that the heat is on and stuff like that. And it had that famous bar scene. Right. But Sam Miller gets out, and the first thing he does with the money is open up a comic book store in Jackson Heights, and not a regular comic book. He went around the country and bought the most expensive, famous comic books in the country. And even though he really wasn't selling any comic books out of his store, that he just wanted the store and he wanted to be surrounded by comic books. And it was so weird about having this $7 million robbery to one of his fantasies was to have a comic book store.
Yeah, and in Sam's memoir on the Brinks, and which I use obviously to write about his life, he took to comics very, very early in life. His dad brought them to him when he returned from these trips that he was on, and he was just a comic book aficionado. It was really, without the history that we know now, I mean, to find him, when they went back in July after they'd been allowed back on the case after they'd sort of resolved the World Trade Center bombing to a degree, that's where they found him. As you said, they found this comic book store, KAC Comics, which is the initials of his children, that he was running right there. And of course, everybody's a little taken aback because they didn't know then of the history of Sam's love for comics. But he gets into that in his book, and I think you mentioned Sam's book. I think my sense is, obviously, having done a lot of research, that Sam's life is portrayed in his book, and his imprisonment, which we know how brutal Longcash was, is all very accurate. But I think, as you noted, his version of the robbery is a little suspect because he wanted to protect the people that assisted him.
Right. And that came out to, and maybe you could describe, because of your contacts within the FBI, and it is amazing the amount of money they put into this, the surveillance, the teams, the going back and forth, who was undercover, how many cars were involved. Maybe describe some of that, particularly in Queens and Manhattan when they were following Father Pat. And it seems no expense was spared.
Yeah, it really, and you noted, I mean, one of the first joint terrorism task force, which is a combination FBI and state and local police, which we now hear a lot of in the aftermath of 9/11. But this was one of the very first ones, I think actually the first one, that was, was in the city and was tasked with his case. And there was, obviously, because of Sam's time that he did in Longcash. And and Father Pat had the gun running charge against him, which, but we must note, was dropped, and there was never really any evidence to support that. But of course, that still gave this belief on the part of some in law enforcement that maybe there's some IRA connection. So it took on this extra level probably of that. And you were right. I mean, the surveillance was pretty much around the clock once they found Sam, and then once they went back to it in July, basically. Both at the Lower East Side where Father Pat was, at the sites in Jackson Heights, the comic book store, and Sam's place, and then the First Ave apartment that you mentioned where the cash was ultimately found, the stash house. And one of my favorite, it was one of my favorite little scenes going back through the history, and I used it in the book, and I tried my darndest to get this FBI agent where I found where she lived, and I just couldn't get her to talk to me, but there was enough from the court record where very on in the surveillance, Bernadette, who is Sam's wife, had traveled to Rochester to visit some of the friends they'd left behind here when they went downstate. And flying back, she's got one of her kids with her, and she just starts chatting up this lovely young woman who's sitting next to her, and they become friendly, and they exchange phone numbers and talk about families. And sure enough, it was an FBI agent. I mean, this is probably 3 weeks into the surveillance or so, who they found out Bernadette was coming to Rochester, and they planted this FBI agent on the seat next to her to fly back and get whatever information she could.
Right. And now, Gary, a lot of your book focuses on Tom O'Connor and his claim that about being tied up, and it kind of came to pass that his story was that he got kind of taken as almost a hostage in the getaway van or whatever, and ultimately got dropped outside his regular favorite bar of sorts, right? I mean, so. It didn't. I guess it didn't actually. That didn't really help his storyline, right? He went into the bar and had a drink, and then got to, I guess, complained of chest pains and had to.
Tom, the cop who was the retired cop, and the person we're talking about, the suspect in the homicides, was believed to be the inside guy, and as you noted, so he basically the claim was that he gets taken hostage by the robbers, driven around town for a while. But the story that he told it in a number of ways didn't match up with the other guards who, to their credit, they even though blindfolded and had their heads covered with money bags, were really able to sort of come up with a lot of the detail of what was going on just by the sounds in this sort of cavernous room of the depot. And to the fact that they were very sure it was a van, and Tom described it as basically a U-Haul type truck with a rollback, which completely went counter to all the evidence at the depot. But sure enough, as you said, he gets dropped off in kind of a vacant area, but it's very close to a bar that he happens to know, very, very close, and he wanders in, and just one little, so it's funny, City Confidential did an episode on this, probably in the late 90s maybe, which you can still find on YouTube, and I think perhaps to keep the Irish theme, they claimed that Tom went in and got a Guinness when he sat down at the bar before he complained of chest pains, but it was actually Southern Comfort. It was not a Guinness that he drank at the bar.
Right. Worth noting.
And another part that you have in here, during the robbery, it didn't come out in Sanskrit, but there might have been a female involved.
Yeah, that's still sort of a mystery. One of the guards, Dick Popovich, one has since passed on, Milton Deal, but Dick Popovich, based on this scene where again he had the bag tucked over his head, and he was very sure they were just going to be shot there. And here's these footsteps coming near him, and they're lighter, and he thinks it could be a woman's footsteps. and then his hand goes underneath the bag to basically check on his breathing to be sure that he's okay, which then he feels, okay, I'm going to make it. And he just, based on that, he just, again, can you say definitively no? He thought it was a woman. But they never heard voices, but that made him think that there might be a woman involved. The part of that that's tough is, there's some people that surmise, well, could have been Bernadette, Sam's wife, and and Sam wouldn't, trust me, I tried so many times to talk to Sam through this, with no luck. But the people that know Sam far better than I said there's no way Sam would have risked, putting Bernadette in there that night at the robbery. So, do we know definitively as a woman? No. Is it possible? Yeah. But the odds seem to be good that it wouldn't have been Sam's wife, Bernadette, if it was.
Yeah. And now, as if this isn't enough, now enter a fellow named Ronnie Gibbons, who, was a charismatic Irish-born boxer living in New York at the time. And, I guess at some point felt like, he was in on the planning of this and never got to carry it out, and went upstate eventually a couple years after the heist, right, to try to claim some of the money.
He came in August of '95. Spent the night with a friend here who he never told us. He basically is this friend who he had known from Liverpool, and the family had then moved here. And though in hindsight now we know why, he'd gotten the friend talking about the depot robbery because they both knew some of the same folks. This guy that lives up here had also worked in the casinos, which are in the book in Manhattan and some of the boroughs there, where Sam had worked and Ronnie Gibbons had worked these illegal casinos. And so he spent the night with this guy, had him drive him by the depot just so he could look at it. And then the next morning, went to an Applebee's restaurant where he's supposed to meet some people. He told the guy where he was going, leaves the car, gets in another car in the parking lot. A waitress sees this and thinks nothing of it and just disappears. And the family, finds out about it pretty quickly because Ronnie on the drive up here had called, Terry Quinn, who's, a bar owner in the store, was a bar owner in the city. And Terry was the firefighting consultant on Rescue Me and was the guy that loaned Ronnie the car. He was a friend of Ronnie's and said, if I don't come back, call my brother in Liverpool. And that's what Ronnie does. That's what
Patty
Terry
Darbanville's car, who Terry was married to at the time.
Exactly, the actress Patty Darbanville, which, at the time, we had the missing car report and everything when I started writing about it a year later and it showed Patty Darbanville's name on it. It's funny. So I called them, and she may have been in the middle of that hit TV show she was on at the time, and she asked me not to report her name because, probably afraid it would be going tabloid fodder, even though she really had nothing to do with anything. And actually, we didn't at the time. We honored that. Then years later, they were fine with me mentioning when I wrote more in depth about it, the name. Yeah, but so Ronnie, I found out a year later, confirm, and then sort of start going on this hunt for Ronnie. Where I was, every corpse that was found in the woods in western New York, I was asking about and constantly. And I just, Ronnie's mom was just a dear person. And Ronnie, as you said, Corey, is just the guy. I feel as if I know him, but he's such an eccentric character in so many ways. And I got to be close to the family, and that just, and finally, that investigation, the missing persons investigation, kind of fell by the wayside with the cops, the FBI here, after 5 years probably. And in 2007, some of the local cops picked it back up again, the Rochester police and state police, and partly because they were interested in Tom O'Connor for some other stuff. And it took a lot of years, 2007 till 2011, when this assistant medical examiner in Onondaga County, Syracuse area, puts together these body parts that had floated ashore a decade earlier in Cape Vincent, New York, may well be Ronnie Gibbons. And the crazy thing is it's based on the body parts were so deteriorated that they thought the torso was a woman at first, and spent a little bit of time believing that. But the shorts that were on the torso were still intact enough that it had, basically the New York Athletic Club logo, and ultimately that helped track down that it was actually Ronnie because he trained there.
Right. So I guess the presumption is that Ronnie went up to try to get his take of this heist that he decided to back out of because they were going to use guns and he didn't want to participate in a violent heist. So, but he felt nevertheless he was one of the brains in hatching the thing. Went up to get ostensibly to get his cut of the money and wound up dead. And years later, was wound up, I guess, washing up, like you said, dismembered and finally identified, right? I guess 2011.
Yeah. No, exactly. He, the foot came ashore at basically on the mainland of Cape Vincent. The torso came ashore on one of 1,000 islands, a small island called Grenadier Island, and then it was determined through DNA ultimately later that they matched, that these were body parts, even though discovered about a year apart, were from the same person. But they couldn't figure out who it was, and they basically buried it in this small child-sized casket in this little cemetery along the St. Lawrence River. And then years later, when this sort of missing persons report, this medical examiner saw that there had been a boxer that had gone missing in Rochester, and the dimensions seemed to sort of match what they could deduce from the body parts. And then they did some more checking, and the foot was in a New Balance sneaker, and Ronnie wore New Balance sneakers, and the underwear was European, and he would shop sometimes. He would go home. So ultimately, when they exhumed the body, they'd done some DNA swabs with Ronnie's family, and it was a match. There are still body parts in the water out there. I mean, the head sadly has never been found. That's one reason they've never really quite concluded how he was killed.
You're listening to WBAI here in New York City, and you listen to Talkback on every Wednesday from 10 to 12 o'clock. And we're speaking with Gary Gregg, author of the book 7 Million, about an armored car heist up in Rochester, New York, that's soon to be made into a major motion picture. And Corey, this is where you come in. You've done a few interviews with Father Pat, and you wrote about the movie. What's the movie going to be about? I know it's based on Sam Miller's book, who organized the robbery, but will they be taken? Because I think now it's a companion book. You have to get the book 7 Million after you read Sam Miller's book.
You mean, yeah, right. That's why I wanted to actually ask Gary this. Now, Focus Features is supposedly making this movie based upon Sam's book, but Gary's book has so much of the detail and the factual, objective reporting. Now, Sam has his story, obviously, and he lived it. Gary reported it kind of parallel to it and got so much of the police information and so much of the detail, especially in the upstate stuff. I mean, Gary, would they reach out to you as far as being? I mean, would your book be very helpful to them? I mean, will they read it? Have you spoken to them at all? I know I spoke to Michael Lerner,
I haven't spoken to them. And as I said earlier, Sam. I think I'm pretty fair to Sam in the book. I try to present everything, but as I've said all along, I think his version of the robbery and his telling is hogwash. But I understand why, because he presented it, I think, to protect the people that helped him.
So you're saying it's kind of like honorable reasons for the
exactly. So no, they haven't. It was funny. Just a couple of weeks ago, and I have to follow up on this. I got an email from a guy in Belfast saying, "Hey, can you send Sam an autographed copy of the book?" And I wrote back and said, "Does Sam want an autographed copy of the book?" And the guy said, "Oh, I'm his PR person, so I want to get one for him." Does that mean they're interested in anything beyond that? I don't know, but no, I've heard nothing along those lines.
Right. And it's maybe he thought it was a comic book, Gary.
Do what?
Maybe he thought it was a comic
maybe
book.
So. If I illustrate it, maybe I'll have a better chance.
Right.
I've done a number of sort of talks and stuff through Western New York and Buffalo and Syracuse and Rochester since the book came out, and that's always this question. The first question is, do I know where the 5 million is? The second question is there going to be a movie? And the tough part with it, I mean, perhaps as a companion piece, as you said, with Sam's, but sort of in isolation, there's not a central character in my book to kind of hang the story on as there is with Sam's, and it almost reads more like a law. And here I am sort of downplaying I'm not very good at this self-promotion stuff, but downplaying the odds of making it into a movie. But it almost reads more as a Law and Order episode, which could it be made into a movie on its own? Perhaps, but it would be great, I think, to have kind of a central character as Sam's does to kind of anchor the story.
Right. I mean, they'll never find this money, right? I mean,
No. I mean,
but
and the one thing
didn't you even hint, Gary, that it might be buried in a parking lot or a couple of places upstate?
Well, there's a belief that some of it, there's these rumors everywhere that some of it might be. The one thing, and I didn't realize this until I did the research, and it came out at the time of trial, is how little of the money they could really track. I mean, there's really a very small fraction of the 7.4 million that they knew the serial numbers of, because a lot of it is this circulated cash, as they call it, that goes all over the place, then comes back to a Federal Reserve and gets shipped out again. And so they don't record, when that comes back to the Federal Reserve before it goes out again, they don't record what's come in. And so that's, they knew very little of, basically the serial numbers of the cash that went out of there. But yeah, I mean, is some of it up here? Yes. Is some of it downstate? Yes. And I addressed the IRA issue, in the epilogue of the book, and talking to some folks that were at Law and Cash and folks that have studied the IRA, et cetera. Is it, the book is sort of, as somebody's joke, it's like a 300-page red herring, not answering the questions. But I came to the conclusion, as those of you know, that the idea that the IRA was the mastermind behind this robbery just didn't happen. And I think the cops came to that conclusion, too. Does that mean that some of the money might not made its way over there because of the sympathies of some of the folks involved, even some of those who've lived up here? No, that's possible. But, as of this date, we really don't know.
Right. From what I understand, it was in 20s, right?
A lot of, there were some hundreds. A lot of the new stuff was hundreds. The what they call the FIT circulation, which they did know the serial numbers of, which is this new money that had been sitting at this Federal Reserve for a while. But yeah, no, a good portion of it was in 20s, which is, when people were making all these purchases in 20s, I write in there about how Bernadette Fennell, bought the family trip to Hawaii with 20s. Yeah. Sam was buying his comic books with 20s, so that obviously raised some eyebrows.
Right. But also you described one point when they came back from Hawaii, an aunt of Bernadette is going through Kennedy, I think, and they grab her there for a pat down and explain what they found on her.
Yeah, she had signed the form, in which the number on I can't remember right now, where basically, I only have so much cash on me, and I forgot. She said she had some minimal amount, and they basically staged this thing where they had one of the, it wasn't FBI agents, basically somebody, customs agent, say, well, you've been randomly selected. Let us look through your purse and your luggage, and sure enough, they find I think about $4,000, largely in 20s, and they.
Randomly there.
Yeah, exactly. And they sort of do a quick look and realize that probably none of it matches. And they came to this conclusion. Again, is the assumption it probably was the Brinks money? Yes. But, there wasn't any of this sort of fit new circulation, newly circulated money that they knew the serial numbers on. Right. And they decided to let her go. Her story was, and who knows, perhaps this could be true. She said, look, I went over with my family. I brought some money. They told me they had all this money that they didn't need me to pay anything, and apparently they did have a lot of money. But it's still hard to imagine that $4,000 wasn't from the Brinks.
She blamed it on Irish hospitality. Harry.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. And so they decided, it was just not right there to have pulled her aside and sort of try to start questioning her and pressing her. Would have given up basically what was going on, and it wasn't worth the risk as far as where the investigation was at that point. So they let her, and she and her $4,000 flew back overseas.
In 20 denominations, that's this volume-wise, that's a huge cache of money.
Oh yeah, when they recovered the cash in New York City and Manhattan, the $2 million. That was 350 pounds right there. So, if you sort of multiply that out, it tells you how much is 7.4.
And they found out about that money by surveillance and a no-knock warrant where they went into the room when no one was there. So that would have been one of the few times you ever hear about a no-knock warrant.
Yeah, it was. You really don't hear about those that often. Where basically, and it's just also what they call this sneak and peek, where
you can't
unlike
touch
the search warrants that we know of. Basically where you go in and you take stuff that you're allowed to take under the warrant. This is a warrant that says you can go in and you can look, but you can't take anything.
Right.
And so that warrant, they went in sort of early morning hours when nobody was in the stash house, and were able to find suitcases and other things full of money, and some of the fresh, newly minted money that clearly matched the serial numbers.
Yeah. You described the jubilation that the FBI had because they had already let the money go to England with the aunt. They went to in Jackson Heights, the travel agency, after she paid for the tickets to go to Hawaii, and they went in and grabbed the money there, and that didn't match the serial number. So the money's disappearing, bit by bit. Some of it maybe for a car, some for comic books, but they still weren't going to move on anyone until they actually had the actual evidence. They really did play the long game on this. They didn't want to just move in. All right, let's arrest everybody. We just got $4,020 bills.
Yeah, no, exactly. And they, and the thing that happened at the apartment there was, there's this money counter, and they say, oh, geez, they're counting the money, and basically say, if they're, and they, right or wrong, who knows, but they came to the conclusion if they're counting the money, they're looking to move the money. And so that's when they finally said, okay, let's get the warrant and ratchet this thing up.
So they listened in and heard a money counter? Is that what happened?
Yeah, that was the claim. So, there's, and I think if, Father Pat's listening, he's acknowledged that he brought a money counter in, but he says that he doesn't, his idea of what the money there was the source was not what he didn't believe that he didn't know it from the Brinks depot.
No, the whole thing is that he knew Sam worked in one of these casinos, in these kind of like brownstone casinos that were run by
exactly, by there. And so he is spotted. He is seen carrying the money counter in to the apartment. And then there's this, there's this agent, female agent with the FBI, and a male agent. They sort of kind of go up to the door, and the story she tells is she listens at the door, and she used to work in the forfeiture unit where they had this money. They had lots of money counters, and she knew the sound of the money counter moving, and she claimed she even knew the sound of the sort of, you'd hear the sort of knock on the table or whatever, and she said she knew that was sort of the money being stacked to being fed into the money counter. So they had seen the money counter going in.
Knowledge.
They had, and they basically believed the money counter was being used, and the decision was kind of collaboratively made with the New York City office and the Rochester office that it's time to move.
Yeah. And Gary, almost finally, because we're running out of time, what was the trial like up in Rochester? I mean, it had to be a circus, because I know we had on Father Pat every week coming on, hammering away at the judge, hammering away at the prosecution, and now you have the intrigue of maybe it's an IRA connection, you got an Irish-born priest, you got this Rochester cop, you got Sam Miller, who never spoke during the whole trial.
Exactly.
Wouldn't do anything. So what was the trial like?
It was, but it wasn't. I mean, really, when there was the media coverage, obviously, which was ample. I mean, not just here, but even elsewhere. But in the courtroom, and it was still a fairly normal courtroom goings on. I mean, the judge, David Larimer, before the trial, had basically said, "We're not allowing any talk of the IRA because you haven't given any proof of the IRA connections." So that that got nixed right away. Right. So the IRA, the alleged IRA connection, did not even become part of the testimony. And the folks the investigators on the case, really by that point, a lot of them didn't want to deal with the IRA stuff too. I mean, there's the prosecution side where anything you can do to sort of color the prosecution in a way that you think may be beneficial to you. But the investigators, I think, had largely sort of dismissed this idea of an IRA connection, and they were looking at it more as just a robbery of convenience. This depot that was just basically there for the taking, and it was taken. And so, really, within the courtroom, it really had more of the flavor of what you would expect with this. But you're right, with this cast of characters, you had Father Pat there, obviously, in the priestly attire each day.
Right, but he must have gotten theatrical in the courtroom a couple times. Right?
Yeah, but God love. Yeah, there was definitely not during the trial, and he actually didn't testify at the trial. He was very, I think, calm and respectful during the trial. Obviously, there were times, sort of pre-trial hearings and things where he let his sentiments be known. Sam, as you said, didn't say much at all. And so you did have a colorful cast of characters, and the attorneys here were in their own way somewhat colorful. But as far really within the courtroom, it really just went as many trials do. And to the credit of the jury, I mean, they obviously deliberated long and came to the conclusion. The acquittal of Tom O'Connor still shocks some of us. But Charlie McCormick, who was the guy who had sublet the apartment, it was a tragedy that guy was ever even charged. It was absurd that he was charged.
But even Father Pat could have been exonerated on a couple of different ways, with Sam Miller maybe testifying, saying that Father Pat had nothing to do with it, and he ended up doing the most time out of everyone.
Yeah, and there's one. You point out something in the book. If there's a chance they're doing a second edition, thankfully that the first one has done well, so that we may be doing a second printing and one. I'm not sure, and I need to go back and do the math. If you take the time that Sam served locally, you have to remember Father Pat was out from the time of the arrest largely to the time of the trial and to the time of sentencing. Sam actually was in jail. They didn't release him during that whole year there. So the time may be somewhat similar if you couple the local jail time Sam did waiting trial versus on top of the time he did before he got sent to Belfast, which he is allowed to, or Ireland, to finish his term there.
All right. Thank you, Gary Craig.
Gary Craig, whose book 7 Million is available online on Amazon, and hopefully Gary will get down maybe to do some promotional in the city.
Yeah, I'm hoping in the next month or two to do some stuff, working on some stuff now, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time today.
Yes, and we'll have you on Radio Free Aaron now at some stage. And
we'll wait for the comic book version.
I'm waiting for the phone call from Father Pat now in about 20 minutes when I get out of here.
Yeah. Well, I hope, and it's funny, people that don't know the story at all, I didn't want to get into the he said, she said, because the book would have been 700 pages. But people that have not known the story at all have come up to me and read the book and said, I said, I don't know if this Father Pat guy, if he knew what the money was from or not, but I think even if he did, he was going to use it for good. I mean, that's the sense they got of him reading the book,
Yeah.
All right, we'll leave it on that.
Thank you,
Thanks, and you're listening to WBAI Talk Back, and we're hoping to have the great one, Malachi McCourt, back in the saddle now in a couple of weeks' time. And I guess until next week, remember, contact all your council people about the ongoing legal battle with the Empire State Building. King Kong was nothing compared to BAI, and we're coming at you.